I teach all manner of analytics and social media, and the program includes courses in audience research, behavior, SEO and SEM, paid and organic social campaigns, working with real clients and news stations and news outlets to understand audiences and measure performance. And what I love about our program in particular is that every class name starts with audience analytics, audience engagement, audience research. And that's because the audience is important, and the audience is why we're here, and it's what enables us to keep telling stories and doing the public service of news and doing research. And so the audience is really important, and we're here today in this section of the symposium to talk about understanding content and audiences. And I think the nexus of content and audiences is engagement. And I have a love-hate relationship with the word engagement because it's my bread and butter, but it's also the thing that no one can define, which kind of stinks. So I hope to tell a story today. We're not going to answer that question, but I hope at the end of our session that we're all feeling a little bit better about that, and that we can rest assured that maybe we don't have all the answers, but maybe just continuing to ask that question, what is engagement, is a good thing. I am so pleased to be joined by three of my favorite people on earth, and truly, at least in this sector of academia. But they are wonderful people whose work in this space I very much admire. And you're going to hear from Jake Nelson from Northwestern, soon to be from ASU, and he's going to talk to you about this very question: is the uncertainty around engagement, and what does this mean? You are going to hear from Dr. Amanda Sturgill, representing some scholars at Elon who have done wonderful research that essentially gets to an example of what engagement is and what it can be. And then finally, you're going to hear from Dale Blasingame of Texas State, who is, again, going to wrap it up and make us feel okay, which is great. And what I want to leave you with before I get off the stage and let the real scholars go to work here is that actually I had a chat with one of our panelists, Jake, yesterday, and he said that essentially everyone in this room is really important, because what he told me was that to appreciate data and to appreciate analytics is to really have an appreciation for journalism, because when we understand more about our audiences, we're really respecting what journalism is, where it can go, and really forge a future for this industry. So I don't know what everyone else out there is doing, but the people who really care about this industry care about analytics. And so I applaud everyone for being in the room today and hopefully taking a step forward and learning what engagement can be and how we can better reach our audiences with strong messages and strong journalism. So thank you. So with that, I'm going to introduce you to this very smart man, Jake Nelson of Northwestern. Welcome, Jake.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. That was like the most awesome introduction that I've ever had before any research that I presented, so I appreciate it. Great, okay. So as Jessica mentioned, I'm Jake Nelson. I'm finishing my PhD at Northwestern. I will soon be joining ASU's Journalism School's faculty as an assistant professor in the fall. And my dissertation has basically looked at it's looked at audience engagement, and it's looked at measuring audience engagement. And what it's really looked at is what the confusion about the lack of measurement for audience engagement has done to the pursuit of audience engagement, specifically within journalism. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the findings from this dissertation by focusing specifically on one of the case studies that I've done of Hearken, which I will explain in detail very soon. But before I do that, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what drew me to the topic of audience engagement. And it basically started when I was actually working as a journalist. I worked for Patch for about 3 years, and I started working there in 2010 at a time where my role was very traditional in the sense that I basically was being tasked with reporting on my community based on my own news judgment, and essentially just giving those stories to the community. So it was very much a one-way relationship with my audience. And what happened over the 3 years that I was working for Patch was that that role changed considerably. And it went from being this one-way lecture that many of you associate with traditional norms of journalism to being one where this term, quote-unquote, engagement came up often, where I was basically being encouraged to bring the audience into the news production process. I was being encouraged to host events where I could get them to tell me what they wanted to see covered, and trying to get them to actually contribute blog posts and make sure that they were commenting on stories as they were getting published. And what I realized when I started graduate school was that this was not something that was just unfolding within the company that I'd worked for, but was a concept that was increasingly popular within the industry at large. And so that led me to just want to examine this concept of engagement more closely, which is something that I've been trying to do as a PhD student. And as Jessica already said, what I found and what many of you already know is that it's a concept that is increasingly common, yet increasingly confusing, because no one really knows. Everyone has their own definition for it, and as a result, no one really knows what anyone really means when they're talking about it. What I have found, however, is that despite the fact that many definitions exist, it seems that the underlying concept that many draw on is basically just this notion that journalists do a better job of serving their audience when they actually listen to and interact with that audience to begin with. So to basically illustrate this, this is a drawing that I had a friend of mine do that's basically just what journalism looked like in a pre-engagement era, where just sort of you're in a room doing your own thing, reporting a story for your audience, and just sort of assuming that the audience will tune in for it because you have decided that's what's important. And this idea that we're moving in a direction of engagement where suddenly journalists are caring enough about their audience to actually interact with them and hear what they think would make the journalism that they're trying to provide better. However, where this confusion, it seems to me, is going to lead to difficulties with this transition is the fact that because there's no consensus around what engagement means, there's no metric to evaluate who's doing engagement well, who's doing it poorly, and what, if anything, it's doing to help journalism actually improve its relationship with its audience. And this is something that I've sort of latched onto for my dissertation because it seems to me that, well, the question that it raises is basically, if there is this measurement confusion, then what does that mean for the pursuit of audience engagement in journalism? How does it hinder it? Or in some cases, how does it actually help it? So to answer this question, I did an ethnographic case study, which means that I basically spent a few months observing and interviewing the staff of this company called Harkin, which, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, it's this audience engagement company. It provides tools and services to, at this point, about a little over 100 news organizations across the world. And its primary product is an online module that appears on news organizations' websites that solicit questions from the audience. So an example of this is in Chicago, Chicago Public Radio has something called Curious City. And what it basically is if you go to a website, it says, what are you curious about? And anyone could just sort of type in a question. And what happens is the journalists on the other end see those questions and can decide, you know what, we're going to go and cover this, we're going to answer this question for this audience member. And what Harkin actually encourages news organizations that use these products to do is get those journalists to actually reach back out to that audience member who pitched that question and bring them along for the reporting process. So it ends up, in some cases, being this incredibly collaborative process by which the audience is actually sort of on the ground floor as the story that they suggested gets reported. And according to Harkin and the people who work there, they're basically doing all of this under the belief that by building this close relationship with the audience, they will increase audience trust and increase audience loyalty and inevitably lead to increased revenue and sustainability for the news organizations that's using these tools. So the way that the rest of this presentation is divided is I'm just going to describe the findings that I have from the study, and then I'm going to go into sort of the implications of those findings. So the first finding was just basically looking at how Harkin actually defines audience engagement. And their definition, as I sort of mentioned, is really based on this idea of collaboration. The idea that engagement really just means how has the audience been brought into the news production process. And the idea being that by increasing that collaboration, you're going to increase the quality of the news that's being provided to that audience. And the reason why that's there are two reasons why that will happen. The first is just if you know your audience better, you will better be able to serve them. If you know what kinds of stories that they want, you can provide those stories in a way that you wouldn't be able to if you just didn't know. But second is that by bringing the audience into the process in such a close-knit way, you're giving the audience access to how the news actually unfolds at a time where it seems like many people are very confused about what news to trust and what news not to trust. And doing so may give people sort of reason to believe in the credibility of journalism at a moment where they just maybe don't necessarily know what goes into making it in the first place. But this is where the metric confusion comes in, because what I found in looking in doing my observation at Harkin was that they would often get asked by news organizations, okay, well, how do you know this works? How can you prove to us that if we follow your instructions and improve our quote-unquote audience engagement in this way that you're conceptualizing it with our audience, that will help us grow our unique visitors to our site, that will help us increase the subscriptions that we have to our product. And Harkin could not give a concrete answer to that question because there just isn't an engagement metric that they could point to that says, okay, well, if you do what we want you to do, this metric will go up. And as a result, even if a news organization saw that it grew its unique visitors or grew its subscriptions or whatever during the time that they were using Harkin's product, it was very difficult for the news organization to actually sort of make that connection explicit because there just was so much variability within that process. The thing is that what I found was that this hasn't really been a crippling development for Harkin. The company still has managed to find lots of news organizations that are willing to take a chance on Harkin's products and spend precious money and resources that they have investing in Harkin's products regardless. And it seemed like there were two reasons for this. The first is just, unsurprisingly, just the desperation that many news organizations feel right now for any answer. They just want to try something because they're just thinking, well, what we're doing isn't working, and so maybe this will. Maybe this will be what helps us. The second thing is that there's just the logic of the Harkin argument has like an innate appeal to the journalists that decide to use the product. A lot of these people seem to not need hard evidence. They were pitched this idea that the audience feels disconnected from the news, and that's the reason why they're not tuning in. And they thought, you know what, that sounds right. I am going to give this a shot. So that leads me to the conclusions that I've drawn. And the first one is that intuition isn't going anywhere. And what I mean by that and why I think it's really important is that it seems to me, at least within the academic research that's focused on journalism, and I would assume within the actual field of journalism practice, that there's this idea that the more and more news organizations turn to audience metrics and audience data, the less there will be an emphasis on news judgment and subjectivity within news organizations, for better and for worse. And what I believe these data are revealing to me from this case study is that it's not an either-or proposition, because basically the audience measurement data only tell you so much. They're really only telling you what is happening, but they're not explaining why it's happening. And that was very evident to me based on the fact that basically it seemed all the news organizations that were meeting with or listening to the pitch from Harkin understood that they were not reaching the audiences they wanted to be reaching, but they didn't know why, and Harkin just provided one possibility for why that might be the case. I think the more important implication of this is that it suggests that the future of this current emphasis on audience engagement may not last. And that doesn't necessarily, it just basically seems to me that there's no way to know right now, at least within the Harkin conceptualization of audience engagement, for example, if engagement is something that audiences actually want. Right now, it sort of makes a lot of intuitive sense for a lot of journalists that it's something that audiences do want, but until there's empirical proof for that, it sort of seems like maybe, but maybe not. I think that this gap presents a really valuable opportunity, and this is something that has also been touched on, basically for people to come together and sort of figure out, okay, well, how do we provide that proof? You know, how do we actually start to put the pieces together to figure out what people actually want engagement to mean and how we should actually measure it so that we could figure out if this is something that audiences are actually looking for in journalism. And it's something that I am hoping to advocate for with my research and hoping that will sort of unfold as things continue in this direction. And that's all. I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jake. And we'll save our questions for the end, hoping to leave enough time for a robust discussion about engagement and what it means. And Jake poses a great question. Well, I mean, what is engagement? How do we define it? And really, how does engagement connect to success? Does engagement equal success? Is it a part of success? I'm not sure, but I think the answer is probably that it differs for everybody. And our next presenter, Dr. Amanda Sturgill from Elon, is going to chat about some research some of her colleagues did and present one example of what success might be in terms of engagement. So I will turn it over to her. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. As you may be able to tell, I am neither Bryan Anderson nor Qian Shu. I'm shorter than Bryan and taller than Qian. So I will be presenting some work that they've done. Bryan actually graduated in December and doesn't start his job till June, so he couldn't afford to come here, and Qian has a new baby. So that's why I'm here today. The work that they did was an undergraduate research project looking at the way that sports teams are using live tweeting, and in particular the effects of the content of those live tweets on engagement from users who are second screening during sporting events. Basically, we can define live tweeting as posting on Twitter as an event is going on, and it can be a valuable way to try to engage your audience sort of in a secondary way by providing up-to-the-minute content on events as they unfold. It can also help to bring in people who are not actually attending to the event in person. So for example, I have been live tweeting the sessions here at the conference today, and I have some people who are not physically present here at these sessions who are able to see the things that are going on. Some characteristics of live tweeting are that it's very fast-paced. It's something that you have to keep up with the stream of it as it's going along. And it is also very focused subject-wise to particular events. So it tends to be kind of episodic types of tweets rather than thoughts that people have. Teams are adopting live tweeting in order to distribute game information, but also more often to increase brand awareness and ultimately to sell tickets, because that is the thing that teams care about the most, is selling tickets and advertising. We're looking at the concept of engagement in social media, as we just heard about. And so traditionally, engagement has been defined as a collective experience that readers and viewers have with a given media brand, with the idea of online media engagement has been defined as the sort of tangible ways, the ways that we can measure of how people are interacting through a technological interface with that brand. All right, sorry. I'll go on down. And so in particular, we're looking at the content strategies that the teams are making from their official accounts as they're tweeting. We decided to do that for a couple of reasons. The first one being that we think that the actual content of the messages may be as important or maybe even more important than non-message features. Non-message features might be things like time of day or length of message, those kinds of things. So we're actually looking at the content of those. Organizations in some cases are expressing some unclarity about how you might actually use Twitter as something more than just a marketing tool, right? So how you can use social media in its social context where you're getting users perhaps to engage at least with you and hopefully with each other around your messages. And there's some scholarship that suggests that brands and consumers see social media differently in their lives, right? That a lot of times brands are seeing social media as broadcasting, essentially, and consumers are not necessarily interested in brand messages in that way. So, okay. There's a couple of content strategies on Twitter that we were interested in, and the first was the use of multimedia. This one, the study data collection was actually performed about 18 months ago for this study, but I thought it was interesting. Just this week I was reading an article about the latest changes to the Facebook algorithm and about how Facebook, for a while, everyone was like, oh, you've got to put video on Facebook because Facebook loves video and they're going to pump it up. And now Facebook's like, no, video not so much anymore because we don't think it's engagement, right? That it's a passive medium, they've decided, so they're kind of deprecating it. So we were interested in those concepts of multimedia. Multimedia is a way of providing multiple kinds of information within the context even of a short communication like a tweet. And there's some evidence that taking in information through multiple media, at once or in rapid series leads to more cognitive involvement, which could be good for brand awareness. So they hypothesized that the use of multimedia is going to actually increase user engagement during live tweeting of social events, and they also did a breakdown by components of multimedia, looking at still images, looking at links, looking at video, GIFs, and emojis. Okay. They also looked at particular wording content that might encourage engagement, looking at calls to action. Calls to action would be specific requests for you to do something, right? Like, you should retweet this now, that you would actually put in the content of your tweet. Or did you like that play? Give this tweet a like if you liked that, or something like that. And then they also looked at giveaways being merchandise or promotional items usually, and they're meant to facilitate conversations by providing something for free. So, we'll take all the users who like this or retweet this, and we'll pick one, and you'll get a team jersey, that kind of thing. And the hypothesis was that using the calls to action and the giveaways would also positively influence the engagement in that live tweeting. Another content strategy was trying to manipulate how visible the message was. And this was done in a couple of ways. The first was by using @ references, so where you're actually directing tweets or highlighting that this person might actually be seeing your content, I guess, in the content of the tweet, trying to get them to engage. And the second was including hashtags. Hashtags can be seen as essentially creating a sort of up-to-the-minute public of people who are following the hashtags. Those of you who are following BEA Vegas today, you understand how that is going. They hypothesized that using mentions would actually negatively influence user engagement, the idea being that, well, this isn't a message for me, so why would I engage in that? And that the use of hashtags would be positive, that it would succeed in creating that public and attracting that attention, getting people sort of to come into the stream, maybe who are from outside. And then they also looked at the valence of the tweets. Valence is a way of looking at the predominant sentiment of the message, and message valence has been found to sort of affect people's evaluation of content. Positive messages tend to, generate more positive views of content. But the idea of how it might reflect on engagement is something that's been less studied. So they looked at that in particular. Because this has been less studied, it was in the form of a research question, which was, how does tweet valence influence the way that users engage in live tweeting? Okay, so their methods. They conducted a content analysis. They looked at 540 live tweets total, looking at 12 teams, multiple sports from different regions, selected essentially purposively, right? So this is not a random sample of everything on Twitter or anything like that. They went in the direction, instead of getting richness of the data that they could collect, instead of representativeness. They did one game per team, all within a particular spring, which was the spring of 2016, and they also had a variety of sports that they included, which had some interesting things to do with the valence, actually. Okay, and so the 12 teams were based on their Twitter follower account, their ability to host a premium sporting event, right, so to actually generate that audience, and then their geographic proximity to other teams. And the number of followers at the time that they analyzed the data ranged from 265,000 to 2.5 million, roughly, of that. The unit of observation was each tweet itself. And the independent variables that they coded, were those multimedia components, so videos, images, GIFs, emojis, and links. The presence or absence of call to action each one, so that was just coded a plus minus, 1, 0 kind of thing, as well for giveaways. Mentions and hashtags, they actually coded for the number of those, so 0 meaning it didn't happen, and then any up to the number that there could be. And then the valence, which was done as a positive, negative, neutral. Dependent variables they defined engagement as retweets, likes, and replies. In this case, they had a better than 0.8 intercoder reliability. They had 2 coders who coded the entire corpus of the tweets. And then for control variables, they looked at the type of sport that it was to see if that mattered, whether the tweeting was during the game or not, so whether it was essentially live tweeting or not, and then whether there was a presence of scores and stats in the tweets or not. It conducted a series of hierarchical multiple regressions that led to a bunch of confusing-looking tables that are probably going to be very small on the slide, so I will tell you the major points. I did not make the slideshow. Okay, so when it came to the multimedia components, actually this kind of has everything on there, I guess. When you're looking at the user engagement, they found in the multimedia that still photos did increase engagement in a couple of ways. They increased were significantly more retweets and likes if you had a still photo. There was also a significant relationship for links, but the relationship was negative. So if you included links in your live tweets, you got fewer replies and likes than if you didn't otherwise. All of the other types of multimedia were not found to be significantly related. And I think this was interesting, particularly for the idea of video, right? So if you're a team, you might think, well, that'd be a great idea. We had this really killer play, and we'll just put a quick live video replay of that. That did not increase your engagement at all. So maybe Facebook's new algorithm was right in that. I don't know. But then the same for the GIFs and the emojis as well. In terms of the message strategies with the calls to action and the giveaways, those were not significant either. So you can save your money on giving the free jerseys to people because it doesn't really make them want to engage with you anymore. Okay, at mentions did have a significant effect. They were negative, generally, as they expected. Hashtags did not have an effect at all. This one, I think, would be interesting to go back and look maybe a little bit more qualitatively at the types of hashtags that they were using and how sort of tight their hashtag strategy is from event to event to event, because I'm going to bet you could probably find an effect there. And then when it came to the valence, it turns out it pays to be positive. So if you had a positive valence in your tweets, and this was the strongest effect that they found as well, that you were more likely to have retweets, likes, and replies. All right. All right, I'm just going to skip through the rest of these boring tables because I've told you all the highlights for those, and we'll go on to the discussion. Okay, so first of all, multimedia may not be the best way to involve users. The sort of developing theory that they're getting from this is that when people are following a live tweet, they're already dividing their attention. Right? They're dividing their attention between the live event and the social stream at that time, and they may not have enough sort of cognitive resource left to be, I'm watching the video and then I'm also watching the replay in the tweet kind of thing, that may not be there. It also could be that people they're using that second screen, that social sort of aspect, as a way of engaging with other people, and that they just don't want the overhead, the time overhead, when I could be seeing what this person said instead of watching this video kind of thing. So maybe that time-based thing might be important as well. Okay, you want to be a little bit careful about the mentions and the hashtag use. Hashtags, again, in live tweeting, not super effective. So again, I think you'd want to think carefully about sort of your hashtag hygiene that you're setting up with that if you've got a fan base who is really committed and knows about that hashtag, that could work well, but if you're developing a new hashtag for every game, that could be problematic because people wouldn't know to search for it, right? And then the different content strategies vary in their sort of capacity to increase user engagement as well. Yeah, okay. There are a couple other things that were interesting that they put in as extra slides people might be interested in, so we'll see if you're interested. So here's the valence, basically told in the form of a little visualization. And you can see, so they've got user engagement as your y-axis, and then your categories of positive, negative, and neutral. And the effect for positive was pretty substantial for that. So as much as, in sports, maybe we like to trash talk a little bit when we do that, maybe on Twitter's not the place that we should be doing that. And then the other thing that was kind of interesting was the sport type that they also looked at. Sport type did matter. You got a lot more engagement around basketball than you did around baseball, and you got more around baseball than you did around hockey. This may be a comparative effect having to do with the valence as well, because as you can see, hockey teams tend to trash talk more than the other teams do. So there we go. And that is everything I know about their paper. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Amanda. And so in that study, what I love about that study is that it defined engagement with only 3 digital actions, right? A like, a share, or a comment. And so while those are 3 great options, there are so many more. And I'm always, whenever I sit in on a BEA session, I'm always thinking, well, what's my takeaway? How can my students grow from this? And so if anything, and we do this, and it sounds like other people do too, walk away from this, challenge one class that you have to tweet about something and divide them into 3 groups: likes, shares, and comments, and tell them to chase that goal and see what they come up with. And that's a super fun, easy experiment that takes no extra time in your teaching hour or hour and a half. But again, there are so many other methods and ways to measure engagement, and our final presenter, Dale, is going to tell you all about them and why they matter. So welcome, Dale.
Thank you. I'm totally stealing that hashtag hygiene phrase from now on. So I come at this issue from a couple of different perspectives. One, I spent 10 years working in TV news, right around the time when social media was just beginning to explode, so that makes me feel quite old to say that. When I was doing my thesis in 2011, I talked to a ton of news directors, and they were asking the same exact questions that Harkin is getting right now of, what is audience engagement and how can you prove to me that this will help? That was the same thing news directors were asking back then was, well, what's the ROI of social media? And we didn't have a good answer for them then. We don't really have a good answer for them now when it comes to engagement. So some things never change. I also co-founded an internet marketing company, and so we're dealing with a lot of brands and clients in terms of engagement and social media and audience in that perspective. And now, of course, in the academic sense of teaching students analytics and things like that. So I'm going to have examples from all 3 of those here today. And as Jake said, we kind of don't know, right? Like, what is engagement? How do we measure it? What's more important? We're all kind of sitting there shrugging and guessing. We know it's probably important, and we know we should be aiming for these things. We don't quite know how to measure it, and I know as academics, we always want to be able to cleanly define and cleanly measure things. And I'm here to tell you that that's okay, that we don't necessarily know how to do that, because there isn't one size fits all for this particular topic. Different newsrooms are going to have different metrics that are important to them. Different newsrooms are going to be going after different types of engagement. Brands have vastly different types of engagement in terms of what they're interested in. So we have to consider that when we're talking about this topic. So I have 3 key points about engagement that I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so talking about. And the first one is that not all engagement is created equal. Second one is that your goals should change over time. These things are changing by the day, and so if your engagement goals aren't constantly changing as well, that probably needs to be looked at. And then the final one is that it should drive strategy as well. So if you're truly interested in audience and engagement, it should be part of your content strategy when it comes to that. So let's go into each of those specifically. And the first thing I'll say here is that not all engagement is created equal. So I want to use the most basic of Facebook engagements, the reactions, comments, and shares, and how I talk about those with students. And so let's start with the most basic one, and that is just the like button, right? This is the absolute bare minimum of engagement that you can possibly have with a piece of content on Facebook. And so we have to treat it as that. It is the absolute bare minimum. And so when you move up to that love button, doesn't seem like a big thing, but that is a psychological difference that somebody has made. It's only 1 second of pressing their thumb on their phone to access that love button, but they had to make that decision to say, I like this more than just liking it, right? So that's a different type of engagement, and I would consider that a much more powerful type of engagement. So keep those things in mind that, you can measure these things from a very small standpoint as well. It doesn't have to be some grand vision. Even something as simple as this can show a different level of engagement. And if you're not talking about something that's horrible and you're getting a lot of angry face emojis on your posts, that's another type of engagement that a newsroom should also be able to use. When it comes to comments, there are usually two different ways this could go, right? You either have the newsrooms who generally value their comment sections and have people moderating them and going through the questions and answering questions and looking for stories out of those comment sections, or you have the ones that most newsrooms have, which is just the straight up dumpster fires, right? Where it's like they post something, they know people are just gonna start arguing about it, they just wipe their hands, they toss the Molotov cocktail and then walk away and don't check it again for 20 hours. So that's a decision that you have to make based on the audience level or engagement level of the content that you expect. And then there's the share, which, again, just looking at these most basic of Facebook metrics, the share to me is the king of all metrics, because I don't care if posts get a ton of likes, I don't care if they get a ton of reactions, I don't care if they get a ton of comments, but if somebody is saying, hey, I like or I think this piece of content is so important that I want all of my friends and family to see it, to me, that's the strongest of metrics. So when I talk to students about content that we're creating for clients, or when I talk to some of my clients as well, like I'm fine with lower levels of engagement on those posts as long as those shares are there. So you have to kind of weigh what you're looking for when it comes to the content you're creating. The second key point is that engagement goals should change over time. And again, I'll use an example from Facebook here. If you look back, especially with how brands were thinking about social, particularly Facebook, over the past couple of years, and you still have this with a lot of brands, the number one sign of engagement for them is, I want my page to be bigger. If we're 10,000 fans right now, I want it to be 15,000 fans. If we're 20,000, I want it to be 50,000. But now, you have to stop and take a step back and think of whether that even really matters. I was on the phone with a Facebook rep last week or 2 weeks ago about one of our clients, and she was trying to figure out what we were trying to do with one of our client pages and basically trying to get us to spend more money with them, of course. And I told her, I was like, I will never pay for an ad anymore to grow the page because that just doesn't matter anymore. If you have a page that went from 5,000 likes to 15,000 likes, you're still going to get basically 0% organic engagement or organic reach of your post. In the end, all you're doing is you're paying more money if you ever do decide to pay to play and promote some of your posts to get it in front of an eyeballs. And I said, am I accurate in this? And she just kind of sat there and went, yeah. And I was like, okay, well, that was at least positive to hear you say that. And so then we, from there, we went on to other topics that, would actually benefit a client or a newsroom or something like that. So that mindset of growth is a huge change that's happened over the past couple of years. And that same particular client, I will tell you that he came to me last week and said, I don't care if any of our posts ever get any likes on the page. I don't care if anyone shares them. I don't care if anybody leaves a comment. All I care about is that they're clicking on them, they go to our website, and we're getting them to sign up on our website. So his conversion goals have changed, his engagement goals have changed, and now our content has to change in order to accomplish those goals. So as newsrooms, you can also think about it in that way, maybe not necessarily just completely driving people to your website or making sales or signups, but you should know what you're hoping to do with your content and using engagement or audience in order to do that. So tying in with that, engagement should drive your content strategy if you truly care about audience or engagement. And I'll use some examples from one of my favorite newsrooms, the Texas Tribune, right up the road from us in Austin. Their ultimate metric of engagement is memberships. So they're a nonprofit newsroom. They, rely on donors and members in order to support the great journalism that they do there. So yes, their number one metric of engagement is memberships, but they also have much smaller metrics of engagement that also matter to them, and it defines the content that they produce on a daily basis. So, for instance, they do a ton of events. They do multiple events every single month. That is a metric, or that is a piece of content or a product that they're producing that is involved with audience engagement. They obviously want people to come and participate in these weekly or monthly meetings that they have in cities throughout Texas. They also have found that this is typically a stepping stone. If you show up to an event of theirs, you're probably going to then check out the content either on their site, or you might become a member and a donor. So again, these smaller points lead up to that big goal of membership. They have newsletters that come out every day, especially when the Texas legislature is in session, which is their main content point there. If somebody subscribes to a newsletter, that is a piece of audience engagement, right? And it is probably the next stepping stone to becoming a member or donating to the cause of this. And then they have emerging content as well. They produced a bot last year in terms of having people converse with the bot to ask questions about the legislature while it was in session, or bills, trying to understand this. Again, this is audience engagement. If you're getting a positive response from a bot or some sort of emerging piece of content, again, it leads to that eventual goal of membership or donations when it comes to that. I'll use a personal example from this as well. When I spent 9 years at News 4 WOAI in San Antonio as a producer, and I was the person, first of all, we were one of the very first early adopters of this whole mindset of you choose the news. I don't know if any of y'all have heard of that. They probably still do it. I looked it up yesterday to try and find some stations who are branding it that way. And what this was, though, is we let the audience, again, this was, dear Lord, this was like 16, 17 years ago. Again, I'm feeling very old right now. We let the audience tell us what stories they were interested in. It was usually them asking us questions that we could find answers to. And then somebody was responsible for counting all the votes. Now, we didn't have Twitter polls. We didn't have Facebook polls. We didn't even have polls on our website. I was the poor soul who had to go through and listen to hundreds of voicemails every Friday so that I could count how many votes we had. And usually every vote was followed by some sarcastic comment about a story we did, or some crude comment about one of our anchors. So at the time, I hated You Choose the News, because I knew every Friday I was going to spend 3 hours listening to voicemail doing that. But here were some of the examples of stories that still stick out in my mind now, even a decade and a half later. One of the more popular ones that viewers always want to know is where's the best place to go see bluebonnets, which are in season right now in Texas and is a big Texan thing. So that was a very popular one. We used to get a lot of suggestions of tell me the best road trips to take within 100 miles of San Antonio. And so that was one that we did a couple of times because viewers kept suggesting it. We got a lot of questions of who the heck is Harry Wurzbach. There are 3 major roads in San Antonio named Wurzbach. There's Wurzbach Road, Harry Wurzbach Road, and Wurzbach Parkway, and no one seems to know who Harry Wurzbach was, and so that was a very common question. And then the last one that always came to mind was, what are all these grackles and why are they on all the power lines downtown? Because if you were downtown in San Antonio, it looked like a Hitchcock movie as you walked through downtown. So these were all very popular ideas, and we would count the votes, and then one of our reporters would go out and do one of these stories every single week. Now looking back on it, now that I'm not the one who has to sit there and count the voicemails, and we have much easier ways to poll the audience on this. And one thing I will say, the reporters fought over these stories because they were typically the most fun stories to tell, and they knew the audience would be into them too. They knew they were going to get a ton of clicks on the website. They knew they'd get a ton of engagement on the platforms that we had back then. So there was no shortage of getting reporters to want to do these particular types of stories as opposed to some of the more traditional blood and guts stories that, especially in our market, were leading the newscast that day. Now looking back on it, I would push for, that's a B block or a C block in a TV newscast. Now, you could do that every single day where you take the audience, tell them, what are your questions? Put 4 or 5 up every day. And then the one that gets the most votes is the package, right, with the reporter. The next one, you go out and just get a soundbite for it. The other 2, you just turn into graphics or VOs with some simple video. And then you've got a nice little audience engagement-led B block or C block of just interesting stories that your reporters are going to want to tell and are probably going to do really well on social as well when it comes to that. So when we started, my first slide said, what is engagement, with the shrug emoticon? And we don't really have a good answer for that. But one thing that I will say is I interviewed Penny Reardon from Gatehouse Media a couple of weeks ago as part of a speaker series that we have at the School of Journalism. And how she said it, and I'm paraphrasing here, was that engagement means a whole lot of things. But in the end, for her, it's about forming a relationship with their readers. They're a newspaper company, so they view it in readers. So that mindset of just, it's that relationship, and I think Jake especially got to that point as well, of having this one-on-one reaction with a reader, whether it's through the content you're creating or the content they're suggesting to you, or the conversations that are happening around those. Is really important. It's about that relationship with the readers or the viewers, and that can either be a good thing or a bad thing, as we've seen with a lot of newsrooms in the country. So with that, I'm very excited to take part in Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Dale. I think that, again, talking about takeaways, I think that the one thing that all of our presenters share today is essentially that there is no one perfect type of engagement. There's no one great way to define it. But I think as we go back to our newsrooms and our classrooms, most importantly, the one thing that we can do is when a news director tells us, well, we need more engagement, or if a student says, well, I'm doing it for the engagement, the best thing that we can do is ask, what kind? And I think asking that question gets the brain turning and thinking about, what do we need to get out of this? Why are we telling this story? And most importantly, who are we trying to connect with? So with that, again, thank you for your attention, and we welcome your questions.
So fascinating presentation, Paul. It was great. My question is regarding, so I've been studying engagement for a while, and I'm very interested in understanding passive engagement, which forms the bulk of any engagement on any website out there. Most of the time, we don't do anything. We just watch, but that doesn't mean we're not engaged. So how do we study that, and what have we done in that regard?
I'll repeat the question for our digital audience. What is being done to measure passive engagement, or less obvious or less measurable types of digital engagement?
I mean, the short answer is, I mean, not much. At least not. It seems right now that there's a lot that just focused on understanding the active engagement, because there's so much enthusiasm behind understanding what active engagement means from the perspective of the industry stakeholders. And so from the perspective of academics, it's almost like a reaction to that. But I completely agree with you that I think an overwhelming amount of the engagement is happening at a passive level. And I sort of like the dot that followed my, like, maybe active engagement isn't really what audiences want, stems from that idea of, like, most people might just read the news, you know? They want their relationship with journalists to be, you tell me a story, I read it, and then I go about the rest of my day. And it seems like, at least from my perspective, that idea is getting a little bit lost in this excitement for trying to capitalize on a closer, more collaborative relationship with audiences.
One thing I would add is that it's easier to measure it with video, because you get those 3-second, 10-second. So you have that aspect of they're not doing anything other than just watching, but you at least know how long they're sticking around. So that would maybe be one way to look at it from just a video-specific perspective. The other thing, and I don't know that there's any quantifiable way to measure this, but in my analytics and social media classes, we work with clients, and the client this semester is very strong. He constantly is talking to them about making him stop his thumb, which again, there's no way to measure that. But he's like, what I want in content is I want to stop my thumb. And that's a passive way of thinking about it. You're not necessarily double clicking or commenting or something, but it's caused you to stop and actually look at a piece of content, specifically on Instagram is what he is dealing with mostly. So there's no way to measure that, but with video you would have those smaller metrics in terms of view time, where they're not necessarily commenting, they're not liking, they're not doing anything other than stopping and watching. Yeah.
Sorry, I did that before I get a little bit.
I think somewhat passive engagement is difficult to, hello?
Yeah, not so good over there.
All right. just kidding. I'll just yell. It's difficult to measure with what we'd consider like analytics techniques, but I think if you look at sort of that Trinity model of analytics sort of thing, you can look on the individual level for some passive engagement things. For example, looking maybe at eye tracking, or again, this is like individual and not like whole audience kinds of things, or also doing talk aloud methodologies, those kinds of things. But I think you need a hybrid method to capture both of those.
Other questions? Thank you. Yeah.
So my question is I guess somewhat related to this, which is about voice interface and engagement with voice interface. Because to me, maybe the only way to measure that is to sort of give some rating and that technology. So do you guys have any thoughts on what the clients you guys have worked with have thought about how we engage audiences engaged?
I'm just going to repeat the
Yeah,
question.
sorry.
So, how can we measure audience engagement with voice or voice interface?
So we have worked with bots in particular, not necessarily voice engaged bots, but especially when it comes to customer service. And it's the new phone tree when you used to call a company and you'd get the press star, press one, press that. Now you're just going through where you're trying to make it seem like there's an actual human there, even though there's not. So we've done some work with that in terms of making those as seamless as possible. And you really have to pay attention to what the people are asking, I think, would be that. And so that's, you're right that it's hard to get into someone's head and anticipate what they're asked, but that's how that whole industry was built on. There was a reason why the call centers in India knew how to answer a question, is because they knew all the questions that somebody was going to ask beforehand, and they had the prepared answers. So I don't know that they might have something better to say about that, but I don't know that we're at that stage yet where there actually is some way to measure that in terms of how to engage, but it's definitely coming. I mean, it's not going away anytime soon, that's for sure.
I feel like there's some interesting, very preliminary stuff that's coming out of industry with respect to that. And one of the firms I know that does a lot of experimentation with that might be worth taking a look at is Stone Temple out of Boston. They're an SEO firm out of Boston, but they do a whole lot of their own original research, and they publish videos and white papers and stuff about that.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
There hasn't been much talk about influencers, which was a fetish maybe a couple of years ago, that everybody was trying to identify them and treat them like important gatekeepers of information and stuff like that. Is there stuff that you're seeing that has either diminished the idea that they matter, or that newsrooms are doing it? It's just not showing up in what you discussed.
Sure. I'll repeat the question, which is essentially what role do influencers play in this measurement space and engaging our audiences? And I had mentioned at the top of our talk here that I have like a love-hate relationship with the word engagement. I actually love-hate the word influencer more. And that's partly because, and I'm sure half the people in this room could tell the same story, where a student will come to you and say, well, I want to be an influencer. And I'm like, cool, that's a great job. I also want to be the next Selena Gomez, the next Kardashian sister, and I want to be an influencer. And I say, okay, well, do you know what that means? And they say, yeah, I want to get a lot of followers. And I'm like, no, that's not what influencer means. An influencer is someone who can get a lot of people to take a digital action. And so that ties directly into engagement. It's not just one person with a lot of followers to get you to spread a message around. It's to get people to do something. And I'll let the rest of my coworkers or colleagues speak here, but one of the things that we try to do is we encourage our journalists to find an influencer for every story they cover. And who is the person making noise in the conversation around the topic you're covering right now, who isn't a Kardashian, but is someone who's involved in the topic you're covering, and identify that person and share your story with them. The worst thing that can happen is they ignore you. The best thing that happens is that they get people to take action with your work. Do any of you have stories or tips to,
I totally agree with what Jessica just said about that aspect of it. The one thing I would add is that if you live by influencers, you also die by influencers, which we've seen with Rihanna and Snapchat and Chrissy Teigen and all the others who are who were now originally Snapchat influencers and are now turning on the platform. So from a platform-specific, mindset, it's obviously treacherous waters. It can be very profitable, but it also can totally sink your platform. I mean, I think the Rihanna day, they lost 1.5 billion in capital. So, I agree with that model of the worst thing that could happen when you reach out to these is they just ignore the story. But finding the right people, and it doesn't always have to be a massive celebrity in order to do that, is key for anything.
Maybe this is like a stretch, but it seems to me, based on the conversations that I had with the people at Harkin, that from their perspective, the reason why Harkin is appealing to audiences is because, in a way, it's the people who who volunteer questions, and those questions get picked, are made to almost feel like influencers because they're ostensibly influencing what the news is for that day. And their idea is that will make that person much more likely to talk about that publication to their friends and sort of promote it as something that is worth checking out because they're in it for the day. So again, it's not something that they could really corroborate. It's just sort of something that they just have a gut feeling based on probably the role of influencers currently in culture as something that would unfold if they do it this way.
And, did you have something?
I was just gonna say, I think it's a little, I think influencers still matter. I don't think we'd see like the front page being about who tweeted what as much as we do if influencers didn't still matter. I think one of the problems that we're having is that you're seeing a shift to some of these conversations taking place on media that it's a lot harder to measure, in particular in messaging platforms. I see Snapchat, is that in WhatsApp, from your own data and those kind of things. And so that's something we can worry about, but we can't really control because we can't measure it as much. And I think that's a big part of the problem.
One thing that I'll mention, I did an assignment with my social class this semester where they had to, it was a scavenger hunt of sorts, but it was about the client specifically that we have in that particular class. So to echo Jessica's point of it's not always the people with the biggest followings or the people who are celebrities to do this. One of the things that they had to do was create a poll related to our client, and they had kind of carte blanche in order to do that. And as I was going through and grading, I noticed one of the students had like 800 responses to the poll. And so I clicked on her profile. She only had about 1,400 or 1,500 Twitter followers. She got more than half of them to take the poll. So that's an influencer. I don't care if she has 10,000 followers or 30,000 followers. More than half of her audience took part in something, did that digital action. So finding the right people for either a brand specifically or a newsroom or even just down to a story specifically to be a part of that is more important than just pure numbers in terms of who that person is or how important they are in air quotes.
Any last questions? Okay. Oh, yes.
So one of the questions I have is about the recent project the graduates did, and something that I feel like with their results, one of the, not issues, but one of the things that they could have expanded on is college-based sports, because the big issue that you guys talk about is current consumers. The Generation Z is about to take over. Like, I'm 22, I'm about to enter the workforce, and I'm the first year of Generation Z, and I feel like media consumption is about to change dramatically. So what are we doing in the industry now to start preparing for the next generation to take over?
Yeah. Well, I don't want to be unfair to my other students. I've got another one in this room who did a really similar study on college-based sports, but it was a couple years ago, and I don't think he's thought about it for a while. So I'm not calling out for that. But yeah, there's a real issue from the college media relations kind of aspect for that as well. And we're looking at that a little bit in our athletic association. So I agree, that's definitely an important and emerging area.
Well, that's our time, folks. Let's give our presenters one last round of applause.